I just want to tell you one more thing about British Chambers of Commerce and what we've been doing. The Chamber's never been so busy in lobbying directly through British Chambers of Commerce, directly into Parliament on your behalf. And this has led to policy changes. And in fact, on this very subject, a number of chambers from around the country joined together on a weekend before the guidance was issued by government to pick it apart and tell government where the holes were and what business would say the holes were. So those changes were made, and although the guidance isn't perfect, it's certainly a lot more rounded than it would have been. But we've never been so busy with our lobbying activities, nor so successful. There's almost nothing we've asked government for that hasn't arrived yet. And the only one I can think of that we're still campaigning for is this thing about company directors not getting support because they paid themselves through dividends or repayment of directors' loans. That is still on the agenda, and we're still pushing hard. But self-employed income support, that came as a direct result of chamber lobbying. The furlough scheme, direct result of chamber lobbying. The extensions to it, chamber lobbying. CBILS, which is all right for some but not suitable for everyone. This is the coronavirus business interruption loan scheme. Has some pretty hefty difficulties in obtaining it. Banks using a very strict criteria, which they had to. I'm not criticising them, but the bounce back loan scheme is much more easy to access, and that was again as a direct result of chamber lobbying. So I want you to know how hard the team and the Chambers of Commerce are working on your behalf. That's enough from me, you'll be pleased to hear, especially with the appalling jokes. I will now hand over to Craig Moore, and thank you so much, Craig, to you and the colleagues at Womble Bond Dickinson for coming on and hosting this. And like I say, with so many people registered, it's clear it's a subject that people are desperate to find out more about. So Craig, over to you.
Thanks very much, Stuart, that's great. I'm just going to introduce the two Womble colleagues, first of all, and then Vince Brooks from Engage Workplace. We genuinely are extremely lucky this morning to have the Womble team present to us. The independent legal guides recognise John Cooper as the leading health and safety solicitor in the country. And throughout his career, John has largely done three main things.
Left of the screen.
One,
does it say turn off original sound?
Hello, can you hear me? Stuart, can you hear me? Do you want to put your thumbs up if you can hear me? I'm not sure what someone was saying. Okay, so as I say, John is recognised by the directories as the leading solicitor for health and safety in the entire country. Throughout his career, he has advised organisations on how to avoid health and safety risks. Secondly, if they have allegedly committed any offences, he has helped them to mitigate any issues. And thirdly, he and his team have regularly prosecuted. So they bring to this a really unique set of experience of seeing it from an avoiding perspective and from a defence and a prosecution perspective. John and his team are recognised for the very pragmatic approach that they take to complex issues like this. So I think you will enjoy and be interested in their session this morning. We've then got Vince Brooks from Engage Workplace. Vince and his team focus on the physical aspects of safe workplaces, and in particular through design. So I very much hope on behalf of Chamber, Womble Bond Dickinson and Engage Workplace that you find this morning's Returning to Work Safely session to be of great assistance. And I'll hand over now to Ashley, who I think is going to start.
Actually, it's me, Craig, who's going to do the first bit. Thank you for the introduction and good morning, everyone. Ashley, you have the first slide. Just very briefly, an overview of what we're going to cover today. Firstly, the current position as it is at 9:40 this morning. At 9:45 this morning, it may be different, so we'll have to take it as it is at present. Secondly, I'm going to deal with the legal duties that arise in terms of health and safety and the management of the COVID-19 risk. general approach, risk assessment and control measures, will be a bit of a canter through those because we're time limited, and we're also going to deal with specific safety issues. If you take away any key points from me this morning and from what Ashley says as well, I think there are a few fundamental issues. The first is that the law has not changed. It is still the same in terms of health and safety. The second is that guidance is just that. Guidance has developed, as it were, a momentum and a reverence of its own, but I'll deal with what guidance really means when I talk about risk assessment. Next, there's a lot of reference in guidance to COVID-19 secure workplaces. COVID-19 secure workplaces are not a legal obligation and they do not exist. And finally, it's not all about PPE, which again is what comes across very much in the media. With that, I'll hand over to Ashley to run through the current position.
Many thanks, John, and a warm welcome to everyone. Before we sort of dive into the detail, for all of us, it's been quite a turbulent last few months, so we thought it'd be useful to take stock and just see where we are at the moment and where we're likely to be in the coming months. And most of you will be aware that from late March, the government imposed the lockdown, which meant that a number of businesses were not permitted to open. And from the 13th of May, we entered into the first phase of the government's process to start relaxing those restrictions. And that's where we are at the moment, so currently in step one. And the government's message was, in simple terms, if you're able to return to work, then do so if you can't work from home. And in order to help businesses with ensuring that employees can return to work safely, the government's produced a suite of guidelines with the title COVID-19 Secure Workplace, which we'll sort of discuss later on. But the second phase, which is what many of you are probably preparing for, is going to start no earlier than the 1st of June. And the second phase is a gradual relaxation again, with some non-essential retailers being allowed to open, sports resuming behind closed doors, and an increase in capacity for public transport. The final step, phase 3 or step 3, that's due no earlier than the 4th of July. And again, more businesses that are currently not allowed to open will be permitted to do so. So that's particularly around sort of personal care, so barbers, beauty parlours, etc., hospitality and leisure. But all of those steps are conditional upon lots of factors, and in particular, the government have outlined 5 tests. And in summary, the government's got to be sure that the NHS can cope. There's been a sustained and consistent fall in the daily death rate. The rate of infection is down to manageable levels. There's enough personal protective equipment, or PPE, to meet the demand. And the government has to be confident that any adjustments made won't result in a second peak of the virus. So we now have a rough roadmap to return back to some form of normality in work, and that's why it's so important at the moment employers understand what they have to do. And on that note, I'll pass you back to John to outline the key legal obligations.
Excuse me. Thanks, Ashley. Irrespective of what phase we are in, phase 1 and phase 2 and phase 3, and the guidance which will change and reflect as we move through those phases, the law remains the same. And the key provisions to bear in mind are your obligations under the Health and Safety at Work Act. And primarily, there are 2 principal obligations on employers, and similar provisions apply to the self-employed. The first, in relation to employees, is to take all reasonably practical steps to ensure the health, safety and welfare of employees. Health, safety and welfare is all encompassing, and so bear in mind that it will include mental health issues, which will be coming to the fore, and it's a good timely reminder, this being Mental Health Awareness Week. Secondly, you have to take all reasonably practical steps to ensure the health and safety, but not the welfare, of any non-employees who may be affected by your business activities or your undertaking. And that will include contractors, visitors, customers, clients, and the like. Anyone who will be potentially impacted by what you do in the course of your business. You'll see that both duties are qualified by what is reasonably practicable. So you're not guaranteeing health, safety and welfare. And that brings into sharp focus what I said about COVID-19 and all the bluster that's been said about that, requiring employers to have secure workplaces. That is not the position. The other point I would make in relation to those general duties is that they are duties which have not changed and will not change. I think because we're looking at this holistically, it's very easy to forget that there are also duties on employees. And if you're going to manage health and safety efficiently, and so avoid the risk of any enforcement action, you need to be aware that all employees have duties as well. And under Section 7 of the Act, they've got two duties. The first is to take reasonable care for their own health and safety at work, which is a duty which probably most know about. The second is less known, but I think it's really important, and it's a duty under Section 7B on every employee to cooperate with his or her employer to make sure that the employer can meet its obligations. And that's particularly important in terms of companies where they may be the employer and have to meet the duties, for example, in relation to risk assessments, but are dependent on their employees to discharge those functions. But employees are under a duty as well. And you can have the best systems of work in the world, but if they're not adhered to and or enforced, then you're not going to be compliant with the law. So what we see in some organizations is a silo mentality. We have the health and safety team sitting in one space and HR in another. If you're going to manage health and safety effectively, particularly in the current issue, you have to take account of the need to police and enforce your policies and to involve HR as well. Ashley, the next slide, thanks. In terms of enforcement action by the Health and Safety Executive, or in terms of retail by local authorities, rail by Office for Road and Rail Regulation, you need to be aware and remember that a breach of health and safety legislation, which can bring about enforcement action, is made out when a material risk is created. That risk need not manifest itself in actual injury or harm. As soon as you allow a material risk to arise and you're not taking reasonably practical steps to meet that risk and control that risk, you're in breach of the law. So by way of example, if a number of workers working at height on scaffold without edge protection, that's a breach of the Health and Safety Work Act and the Work at Height regulations. If one of them falls and is injured, the offence is still the same. That just heightens culpability and the penalty. It's all about identifying and controlling risk. You're not expected, as I said, to eliminate the risk of COVID-19, it is a duty that's reasonably practicable. And I think one of the difficulties all organisations have is that slight disjoinder between the law and what's being said in terms of guidance. But the slide there summarises what you need to do as an employer. Think about the risks that you face and do all that's reasonably practical to minimise them, but recognising that you cannot completely eliminate the risk of COVID-19. There's actually an argument to be had, which I'll just touch upon here because it's a session in its own, that COVID-19 is not a risk arising from your work activities, and therefore it's not covered by the health and safety legislation. It's a public health infection, which does not arise from your work activity. That said, I think it would be a brave and perhaps foolhardy employer who decided that they were not going to take any action in relation to COVID-19, and it does need to form part of the risk assessment process. And as you'll see, failure to comply can result in enforcement action in the form of improvement notices, prohibition notices, or ultimately criminal prosecution. And HSE's changing attitude to that I'll deal with shortly. Ashley, the next slide, please. So risk assessment is absolutely fundamental to managing health and safety. And the obligation is found in the Management of Health and Safety Work Regulations. You have to carry out a suitable and sufficient risk assessment, and the purpose of doing so is to take steps to comply with your duties under wider health and safety legislation. And those duties are the duties contained within the Health and Safety at Work Act and within other legislation. This is where guidance comes in. You should factor in to your risk assessments guidance issued by the HSE, central government and Public Health England. If you do so, then you are likely to be deemed to be doing all that is reasonably practicable. So that is the relevance of guidance. If you ignore guidance, you cannot be prosecuted or any enforcement action taken against you for simply not for ignoring the guidance. But the way that enforcement would come would be by criticism that you were not factoring into your risk assessment process the guidance and following it. So guidance in itself, no legal status, very important in terms of risk assessment in order that you can identify steps you need to take. Ashley?
Thank you, John. So just looking at risk assessment, which I think John sort of emphasised is really key to managing this crisis. The government guidelines sort of set out some detail as to the issues you need to cover, but I'd just like to highlight some of the issues here and general approach. And the first one is the fact that you need to consider everyone who plays a part in your business. And as John outlined, that reflects your duties towards your employees and others who might be placed at risk by your business. So that could be shoppers, it could be delivery people, it could be contractors on site, etc. Anyone who plays a part in your business. And when focusing particularly on employees, communication is really important here to understand if any of your employees are more vulnerable to illness than others, and that then allows you to take steps and start the dialogue to manage those particular risks for that individual. And using the government's language, there are two categories that have been singled out, and that's those people who are considered to be clinically vulnerable or clinically extremely vulnerable. And when you look at the guidelines, it then, depending on which category someone falls within, then determines what approach should be taken. So extremely vulnerable workers, for example, are encouraged to be shielded and kept at home. One issue I don't think is really emphasised sufficiently in the government guidelines is the fact that most businesses will be making quite significant adjustments to their workplace arrangements. And that can have a number of knock-on consequences that need to be considered. Then there are two strands to this. The first is that any existing control measures, risk assessments, policies, procedures you had might be impacted by the amendments you've made. So you need to look at all of your risk assessments and see if they're still suitable for the job. And secondly, if you're starting to change and make adjustments to the workplace, you might actually be introducing some new risks. And just as an example, cleaning products are hazardous substances. So you'd need to consider, well, if people are handling these chemicals, have we done a risk assessment in relation to that particular task? Another issue that John touched on is the spotlight upon mental health. And that's incredibly important in these circumstances because it's not only concerns about safety at work. I imagine most people have concerns about job security. They may have concerns about relatives who are vulnerable to illness. And generally speaking, it's a very sort of stressful time for most people. So again, it's an issue that should not be overlooked. And as John said, it's been the law since 1974 to look at the welfare of employees. Tied into mental health is looking at the potential for illness and staff absences. And there are 2 points to this. The first is if people are off work, do you have sufficient numbers to cover that particular person's job and role? And perhaps more importantly, when people are covering for others, are they competent to do what you're asking them to do? Do they have the right training and skills to be able to do those tasks successfully? If they don't, that will inevitably add to work-related stress and create mental health issues, in addition to obvious sort of safety risks. Home working is very much encouraged by the government to keep people out of the workplace for as long as possible, but that too brings with it its own risks. And just because people are working from home, it doesn't mean to say you don't owe them any duties. Quite the opposite, the duties are very similar, if not the same. And in practical terms, you may particularly want to focus on helping people with display screen equipment like laptops and tablets and how to set up their desk and working environment so it doesn't cause sort of neck strain and sort of repetitive muscle injuries. And an issue that John and I have come across is giving clear instruction in terms of what happens when someone starts to show or report symptoms of COVID-19, whether that's during the workplace or outside the workplace. Most people will be very concerned about that, and we think it's really important that you have a clear process in place to manage those circumstances. And finally, just touching on waste disposal, it's again quite easy to overlook this, but if you're generating lots of waste from cleaning and potentially involved with infectious material, consideration should be given to how you dispose and handle that waste appropriately without creating additional risks. And it's also quite easy to overlook the risks from unoccupied premises because lots of the guidelines focus on the management of people. But we've just outlined a few issues there that should be taken into consideration. And I'd just like to highlight in particular the risk of Legionella from water systems, plumbing systems, etc., that haven't been used for a period of time. They should be checked to ensure that there isn't a risk before people are allowed back into the building. The safety of plant and equipment. If you have, for example, a lift on your premises, you need to make sure that it's still in safe working order before you allow it to be used. Same goes for sort of any emergency systems, so fire detection and emergency lighting. Are they still in good working order? And the final point there just touches on emergency evacuation procedures. If people are evacuating a building, it's an obvious point of congestion. And again, some thought should be given to one, have you adjusted the workplace so you've got different routes of exit possibly? And how practically do people congregate and where to ensure social distancing? It's not always possible, but it should be considered. So once you've considered the risks, the big question is, well, what steps do you need to take to address those risks? And in the legal terms, what are the reasonably practicable steps you can take? And we've touched on the Public Health England and government guidance to businesses, the Covid-19 secure guidelines. But I'd also like to highlight that there is more specific guidance out there for particular issues published by individual regulators. So take the HSE, for example, it has some more detailed guidance on issues such as fitting of face masks, working from home, that goes over and above the government guidance. And one of the key points I think John touched on as well is that this is a very sort of dynamic situation, and the guidance is evolving, and I suspect will continue to do so as we move through the phases of the return to work process. And so it's important you keep on top of developments. So just touching on the government guidelines, and we don't have the time to go through the detail, but I'd just like to highlight the sectors that the guidelines apply to, and they're listed on that slide. And what I would say is, whilst they're sector specific, there's actually an enormous degree of overlap between them and lots of common principles, and the approach is broadly the same. And just touching on the approach, all of the guidelines outline a hierarchy of control. And in the first instance, employers are encouraged to consider who can work from home. And if people are able to work from home, then they should do so and be encouraged to do so. If that's not possible, then the next best thing is to focus on social distancing. So keeping people at least 2 meters away from others. If that's not possible, then the fallback is, well, have you considered all other steps that can be taken to reduce the spread of the disease? And that's where we get into the realms of things like physical barriers and screening, hygiene, managing work shifts and patterns, and segregating the workforce. So there's a clear hierarchy there. And you'll notice so far, we've not mentioned anything to do with PPE, face masks or face covering. It really is a matter of last resort. And when focusing particularly on social distancing, for those people who have to be in the workplace to undertake their work, the guidance outlines those 6 headings, which I won't go through in detail, but as you can see, it's asking you to consider people coming on site and off site. And there's a particular focus there on staggered working times, which I think we'll hear more from in the coming months because it's a particular concern for public transport usage. Movement around buildings, implementing one-way systems, for example, and marking out particular areas for people to work within. The same goes for workplaces and workstations, reconfiguring offices to distance people from others, keeping meetings to a minimum or hosting them virtually where possible. And an area of particular focus is sort of common areas and shared facilities, particularly in a building that has multiple occupants. You may share a canteen, for example, or wash facilities. It's quite difficult to control the movement without cooperating with everyone concerned. And the guidance finally deals with accidents and incidents, and it's not particularly detailed, but we found there's some very helpful guidance for first responders that businesses may find helpful when looking at the steps that can be taken there, particularly to protect first aiders who are at higher risk because of the nature of what they're doing. There's similar sort of considerations apply to managing others, so those that aren't employees, so customers, visitors, contractors. Again, the focus on limiting numbers, controlling movement, and importantly, explaining what you're expecting them to do. And there's a very heavy focus on cleaning and hygiene and having a discipline around that and increasing the frequency of it. And we've just highlighted some particular issues to consider there, such as sort of shared equipment and vehicles, and particularly areas such as sort of, wash facilities. The guidance has a number of suggestions there. We've touched upon workforce management, keeping people segregated as far as possible to avoid the domino effect. So if one person is showing symptoms, it doesn't then have an implication for the whole business. You can keep it to quite an isolated group of people. And that might look like keeping people on the same shift patterns, or having the same group of people or gang of workers working together. And finally, sort of the guidance talks about PPE. And I think it's worth pausing and focusing on PPE for a moment, because the guidance couldn't be stronger in terms of its view on this. And I'll just read the quote there. It says that COVID-19 needs to be managed through social distancing, hygiene, and fixed teams or partnering, not through the use of PPE. So that's very clear that it is the last resort if all else fails and just cannot work. And it goes further than that to say that employers should not be encouraging the precautionary use of extra PPE just to protect against COVID-19 outside of a clinical setting. And even further than that, it's the guidance is that the risk assessment should reflect the fact that PPE offers extremely limited protection. So I think the message is very clear on this particular issue. Touching briefly on some other issues that you should consider. The first is sort of health screening and testing. There's been a lot of discussion and debate around temperature screening, for example. I'd just focus on that because that has potential data protection implications. You're dealing with sensitive health information. So one to be aware of there, to consider carefully. As John touched on, the importance of monitoring and enforcing your own policies and procedures to make sure you're doing what you say you'll be doing. Communication is absolutely vital on two parts. One, so people know exactly what they're expected to do and how to do it. That includes third parties such as visitors on site. And the other part to that is winning hearts and minds. And by that, I mean, if you can get the workforce to buy into your policies and procedures, they understand why you're doing what you're doing and the approach you're taken, it will help allay any concerns and build confidence that the workplace is being well managed, and it's more than likely to increase the compliance because people have bought into that process. The other point to mention, again, it's more focused on mental health issues, is communication and having discipline around that, because it's very easy to say, well, of course, we'll contact people whilst they're working at home, and but life goes on and people can get distracted by work and other things. So it's important to have some discipline around that process to avoid people feeling isolated and unsupported. The final issue I'd just like to touch on very briefly is contact tracing. There's been a lot of confusion around this because on the one hand, you've got the public health proposals around using apps to help contact tracing, but the actual guidance for employers is entirely silent on this point, which reflects the fact that there's no legal duty to have a system in place to trace contacts. But the European approach is quite a good one to take, which is if there is an issue in the workplace, it's a good idea to tell people in the workplace who might be affected by that, but there's no need to name the actual name of the person who's showing symptoms. It's just taking a judgment as to which people might need to take measures to protect themselves following that situation. So that really was a whistle-stop tour of risk assessment and the guidance. I'm just going to hand you back to John, who's going to look at the regulator's approach to enforcement during this time.
Thanks, Ashley. Slide is entitled HSE's Changing Approach to Enforcement, but do bear in mind that enforcing authorities for health and safety legislation do vary. So in retail and office premises, it's local authorities, and in railways, for example, it's ORR. There's been a change in the approach to regulation and HSE's stated approach. Initially, it was all about, in effect, guidance and encouragement. They've changed their approach to enforcement in that there are very few visits or inspections going on, and so they were pushing this approach of, well, we'll help you, we'll give you specific advice, which is different. Next slide, please, Ashley. That has changed in that last week, the Chief Executive, Sarah Alban, for the first time referred to the risk of prosecution and the sanctions in terms of very high financial penalties, or indeed in relation to individuals, the deprivation of liberty through custodial sentences. It was a bit of a shock when she brought enforcement by threat of prosecution to the fore, but I think it's a real risk. She referred specifically to where there were breach of enforcement notices, but breach of a notice is not a prerequisite to prosecution, and I think that we are going to see a change in approach, and that when employers return to work, if there is not a robust system of risk assessment to put in place control measures, HSE will not be slow to take enforcement action. Ashley, do you want to carry on?
Sure, thanks, John. So just before John sort of has some concluding remarks, we just wanted to draw some particular issues to your attention, and we don't have the time to go through them, but we just wanted to sort of draw them to everyone's attention because there is very good guidance available, particularly on the HSE's website, to deal with issues around the testing and inspection of equipment that has to be sort of certified, such as lifting equipment, forklift trucks, lifts in offices, pressure equipment, etc. There's also really good guidance around occupational health assessments. So if you're working with vibration, noise, asbestos, there's details there around access to the relevant professionals to undertake those tests and assessments. I think I touched on first aiders, the need to include them in your risk assessment process. HSE has some really good guidance there on making sure you've got enough first aiders available and give some suggestions. Home workers, we've touched on. HSE has some very good guidance to help employers understand what information, instructions, and assessments need to be done in relation to those working from home. Mental health, we've touched upon throughout the presentation. It's a key issue and not to be forgotten. And there's a large piece of work around communication there, but also more generally how the workflow is managed. And the final issue, which has been quite contentious, is in certain circumstances, you have to formally report incidents to the HSE, and that's under legislation called RIDDOR. And there's some guidance there as to the circumstances when you would have to formally report to HSE a case of COVID-19 in the workplace. And I think it's safe to say, John and I take the view that it's likely to be rare outside of a medical context, unless there is a very clear sort of systemic issue within the workplace. I'll just hand you over to John to wrap up with some concluding remarks.
Thanks, Ashley. I can take this in very short order. You've got to make sure that you plan for return to work, and that your planning is based on a robust system of risk assessment. Everyone in the business has a role to play, management, employees, HR, and the like. Don't forget that the duty extends to, in relation to employees, to welfare, so including mental health. Communication is absolutely essential, and indeed the government has issued guidance saying that if you have 50 or more employees, you should actually publish your risk assessments. And finally, keep up to date with current guidance and developments, because if you don't, you won't be reviewing your risk assessments and you will fall foul of the law. That's a counter through, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ashley and John. That was fantastic. That did exactly what I hoped it would do, which was give us a really practical run through of what we need to consider. And also, I took some comfort from that about, particularly about, as long as you're sort of following guidelines, doing what's reasonably practicable, and so forth. I do have a couple of questions to start off, but first, while we're also all formulating questions, could we go to Vince Brooks from Engaged Workplace, who just wants to talk to us for a couple of minutes about the physical distancing and what they can do. So Vince, I'll hand over to you, and don't forget to unmute yourself. You have. Good.
I'm unmuted. Okay. Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Vince Brooks. I'm a director at Engaged Workplace. We're a local business based in Estover. And we design, refurbish and fit out office environments across the Southwest. So I'll just share my screen. There we go. Anybody see that?
Yep.
Great. So as a design-led office interiors company, we're currently inundated with up-to-date research and product developments from our suppliers to assist with a safe return to the workplace. I would like to outline briefly some of the practical things we believe you should consider both immediately and for the long term to enable the return to work in a safe environment. This information we've been sharing with clients and contacts as an outline just to say some of the services we can offer to assist you with creating the safe environment. So in terms of safety, here are some of the things you should consider. In the short term, installing acrylic barrier screens, either fixed or placed on top of existing screens, will provide protection and limit the spread of the virus. An example of how this might work with maximum effect but with minimum disruption, I'll come on to in a moment. Also to consider full height mobile screens to provide extra protection in walkways, communal areas and shared spaces, for example, around printing areas, reception, or possibly coffee machines and open shared spaces. Sanitation, as we know, is key to limiting the spread of the virus, and providing mobile sanitation stations near entrances and exits is a great way to encourage hand washing throughout the day. Again, these can be strategically positioned in the public spaces like receptions and the printing areas. These are particularly areas where people congregate in groups away from their workstations. So in terms of space, the key things to consider is, of course, physical distancing and how you can accommodate this at the workstation. It's all about reassessing your needs and planning your space accordingly. So let's take a look at an example of how to plan safe distancing using screens to achieve a full return to work. So here we've got an example of a team of 6, traditional workplace where there may be bench desking, and this shows a group of 6 workers. This can obviously be scaled up to 60 or 600. You need to adhere to 2-meter distancing guide. If you do nothing, the maximum you can achieve, as you can see in the top left-hand corner, is a 33% return to work. So that's if you do nothing. However, when you introduce lateral screens between the desks, you can achieve a 66% return to work. So in the bottom left-hand corner, you can see by not occupying the central desks, but have screens in front of each person, then that mitigates the risk of transferring across the workstation. The circle denotes obviously the 2 meter distance required. However, when you introduce lateral screens between the staff, both face to face and at the sides, creating a booth-like an effect, you can then achieve 100% return to work, which negates the required 2 meter distancing at the desk. So you can see that the barriers between actually go beyond the edge of the desks to create that 2 meter protection from spread. On the right-hand side, you can achieve the similar thing by adding more distance between the desks and having face-to-face screens. Now, I must point out that these face-to-face screens are actually 1,500 high off the ground, so they're roughly about 750 above the work surface. By adding these, the distancing between the desks, so you can create a larger desk area, but you will need to replan the space to accommodate the larger desks. So what I come on to now on the first screen is really just that the desks are only a part of it, but hopefully that gives you an idea of how you can achieve full capacity. Other things to be considered, some of them listed here, are wider walkways, less use of meeting rooms, or even fewer chairs in those meeting rooms, all at 2 meters distance apart. Also, plan different entrance and exit routes if possible, or stagger arrival times, as touched on before. Plan one-way flow systems with clear signage and floor demarcations, particularly for small spaces such as lifts and toilets. Now, lifts are always a bit of an issue, but you can create those spaces within the floor, on the floor in the lifts, and limit obviously the number of going into the lifts. And finally, if you are considering to continue with a number of staff working from home, then this could present an opportunity to replan the office space completely for the longer term in order to accommodate all these necessary changes. However, do be sure to adhere to the HSE guidelines for home working, which, to be honest, we've all been allowed to turn a blind eye to in the last couple of months. However, this is likely to be enforced if some home working does become a more permanent option. Providing workers with home office workstations, including an office desk, an ergonomically adjustable chair, not a dining chair, which we're all probably used to more recently, and a secure lockable pedestal for office files will help HSE compliance. Also, by adopting corporate branding across both in-office and home office will help to provide continuity and a sense of belonging to your company. At the end of the day, it is about engaging all of your staff wherever they are working and giving them the peace of mind that your company is a safe place to work. If you would like to hear more options available, please do contact me directly, and there's my email address to be in touch. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vince. That was really helpful. And feel free to put that email address or your telephone number in the chat so everyone can see it. And if you wouldn't mind now turning off your screen sharing so we can all see everybody. I've got a whole load of questions. Now, I appreciate we're due to finish at past. I will try and keep this short as possible. So if I could ask the people answering the questions to keep the answers as short as you possibly can too. I'll start. We've got 3 or 4 in the chat, and I see Isla Grice. I'm assuming that's Ian LaGrice has got his hand up, so I will come to you shortly. If I could just start with one sort of quite broad-ranging question, which perhaps just one of the most suitable from Womble Bond Dickinson would answer. But what do employees do if they don't feel safe, if co-workers are not complying with employers' rules? And what should employers do if employees don't want to come in or say they don't feel safe?
Shall I peel that one, Ashley? Firstly, you've got to make sure that before you get your employees back in, you're satisfied that the systems are safe. If employees raise concern as to fellow workers not complying with the requirements, then those allegations need to be investigated and appropriate action taken. You've got to enforce your systems. I'm not an employment lawyer, but we're talking here breach of health and safety legislation on the part of employees, which is a criminal offence. And so all reasonable options open to employer, it seems to me, would be considered reasonable. In terms of employees refusing to come into work, essentially, if you're satisfied that there is an appropriately safe workplace, then employees should come into work. The way in which you approach that from an employment law context, I think, is quite difficult in the present time. You need to be sensitive. It's really about winning hearts and minds, and if there's particularly if a trade union's involved, making sure that they're on board as well.
Okay, thank you. Another question for 50+ employees. This is from Karen Field. For speed, I'll read these out rather than go to the individual applicants. For 50+ employees, you say risk assessments must be published. Do you mean on your own website or just internally to staff? On your own website is a recommendation. It's a complete nonsense because a risk assessment document can be very complex and it's only guidance, but you should do it. But just put in the key findings and the key control measures and you'll be meeting the need. A sort of executive summary there. Yeah. Kirsty Spencer asks, once the NHS Track and Trace app is released, do you think there'll be an expectation that this would be a control measure which employers should include in risk assessments? Ashley may want to come in on this one, but my view is no, because there's no obligation on employers in relation to the track and trace.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that, because it starts to cause, you start to then blur sort of the workplace with public health issues. So it's a tricky one. Okay, I've got lots of questions coming in the chat. I'll go to Ian LaGrice because I don't know how long he's had his hand up, but perhaps Ian, would you like to come in and ask your question there?
Yeah, of course, appreciate that. It refers back to, I think, something that John said earlier about the complications, obviously multi-tenanted buildings, specifically office space, and the hierarchy of sort of work from home if you can, and the 3 stages there. It was astonishing how quickly businesses were able to work from home, and I think everyone was surprised about the quality of their IT. But it's also surprising me how many office occupiers are starting to migrate back into office space and making plans to repopulate their buildings. And it's just really, and must divulge a sort of personal interest in this as a property manager. It's just the sort of the split between, you know, quiet enjoyment, etc., under the lease and allowing tenants and business to back in, against the work from home guidance that's been issued, against what you have to do within the common parts. And it's just really where you see the sort of responsibilities in the legal position on the common parts and how much strength a landlord and or property manager has to stop people coming back in, if you like.
Yeah, well, I'm going to sound a bit like a lawyer now, for which I apologise.
You are.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Well, I try not to give that impression. Starting point is that everyone has concurrent duties. So the landlord will have duties and the tenants will have duties. Second point is there is an obligation there is an obligation on employers to share relevant risk assessment information. So your tenant should be sharing with you, particularly where it impacts on common parts. Can you stop them from coming back into work? No, and as long as you've been shown to take reasonably practical steps by making inquiries as to whether or not they have in place appropriate procedures. You shared with them any details of any risk assessments which give rise, which indicate risks from your activities, which may impact on them and their employees. You'll be doing all that's reasonably practical, and any sanctions are likely to fall on the tenants.
Thank you. So I'm aware that a few people have had to leave and have put their apologies in the chat. I think it's really important we keep this going if people want to. I won't be offended if anyone needs to go to another meeting. I don't usually like things to go on beyond the finishing time, but we've got so many questions. If it's okay with the panel, we'll just stay on for another couple of minutes. We will keep the answers really crisp. From Sarah Gibson, hi, what are the recommendations around use of air conditioning and opening windows? Any thoughts, recommendations, guidelines or rules there?
It's part of your risk assessment process. There are no clear guidelines on it, but the general view is that ventilation is a way of reducing risk. Air conditioning carries with it other risks. So factor it into your risk assessment process.
Thank you. From Sally Basker, how do the alert levels fit into this? Will social distancing be relaxed as the levels decrease, as suggested on the BBC?
Without diverging too much in terms of sources, that is likely to occur. It's more of a public policy issue, and one of the challenges is, as people become more confident, they will themselves start relaxing. The regulations have to be reviewed every 3 weeks, and they be made plain that if there's a concern that particularly the R rate rises, then wider restrictions will be imposed again under regulations.
Do you think, somebody asked in the chat earlier, it's quite a general question, but do you think this means the end of hot desking and even open plan has suddenly become not so popular?
I don't think it will, but I don't think hot desking will disappear, but I think it'll all be underpinned by risk assessment and in particular cleaning and hygiene issues.
Yeah. Okay, I think that's the end of the questions. If I've missed one, I apologise, and please raise your hand if you want to. If you've got any last questions for any of the panel. I found that really interesting and helpful, and in some ways, as I say, took huge comfort from it, that as long as you're following the guidelines, you've done a risk assessment, you're doing everything reasonably practicable, then that should help. So I see Jason shared the government guidance. I was about to say there a link to it in the chat. That's also all the government guidance is on the BCC, British Chambers of Commerce website, and it's really well split into an easily navigable system. So if you want to work through the BCC coronavirus hub, it's a really good resource where you just choose the bits that are relevant to you, and it helps you cut through all the fog of mass communication that there is out there at the moment. So I'm looking, I don't see any other questions in the chat. I don't see any hands raised, so I'll just wrap up if I may. I think it was really, really lovely to see so many people on the call. We had 80 at one point, and to see old friends and you. It shows how important this subject is, and I'm really, really grateful to you all for joining, and I'm especially grateful to the panel, to John and Ashley and to Craig and to Vince for coming on and giving us their expertise. Vince, feel free to put your details in the chat if people want to get in touch, and we can of course signpost to Vince from Engage Workplace. I noticed that James Twine has put his details in the chat as well. He's an employment lawyer, and I'm sure he would be able to answer any questions that are specific around employment law. This presentation, this whole event, will be available on our website, and there'll be a link to it in our newsletter. So if you want to catch up, if you want to show it to friends or share it, please do. I should have said at the start we were recording it. If any of you don't want to appear, then let us know. You can contact me, Helen, or Olivia. Please, if you've enjoyed the event, please share on social media using the hashtag ChamberLive. Say how much you've enjoyed it and how helpful you found it, because it's really important that we share the word. As I've said before, and I make no apology for saying, a strong chamber with lots of members is really, really helpful to the city and to the county, and to ensuring we get the sort of support we need from government, that our voice is heard. So a powerful chamber is really, really important, and please do share the word about your Chamber of Commerce and the value it's adding at the moment. Next event leads on very nicely from this. I see next Chamber Live, Tuesday the 26th of May, will follow on from this theme, looking at issues about people returning to work, in particular managing expectations of team and their mental health, which is really, really important. We know this is a massive issue, which the Chamber has not shied away from dealing with. So I think that's everything I needed to say. Just a final thank you to the panel. We're going to do that very rare thing that people don't tend to do on video conferences. I'm going to unmute you all, and perhaps as we conclude, if you could thank the panel with a little round of applause, that'd be really...